Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. What do you do when you're the organizer of a workshop and the speaker standing right at the front, won't stop talking? Back in 2004, our business was very young and we were hosting our first ever workshop in the US. We'd conducted a few workshops in New Zealand, but when it came to making this overseas trip, we felt a lot of pressure. And so we decided to have 2 additional speakers at our workshop. And day 1 started out, and then we had day 2. And day 3 of the course, one of the speakers was heading dangerously close to the time that he had been allocated. So you do what you always do, which is at the end of the room, you're signaling, okay, your time's up. So I started to move forward. I moved from the back of the room to the middle of the room. But he wasn't slowing down. With 3 minutes left, I was within 10 feet of him, but he didn't have any intention of wrapping up. Did he overstep the mark? Of course he did. The slides kept coming, and I did something that I'd never done before. I stepped up to him, put my hand on his shoulder, and said to the audience, "Steve's done a wonderful presentation. Please give him a warm round of applause." And it's that action that brought his presentation to an abrupt halt. However, such embarrassment could have been avoided if he had timed his presentation well. But how do you time your presentation so that you never overstep the mark? Over the years, I've learned a few tricks when making presentations. And an excellent presenter can avoid time overruns with design rather than time management. And that's because things go wrong on the day of the event. The sound system may throw a tantrum. The presenter before you might cause a lot of disruption. And sometimes even a well-meaning MC may spend too much time introducing you, which gobbles up a lot of your precious time. Time management doesn't help in this situation. Design does. And most of the design depends on how you treat the last segment of your presentation, which is really the part where you run out of time. So let's find out the 3 elements that you need to consider when designing a presentation. The first thing is why you need to design part 3 of your presentation first. The second is why part 2 should have the most examples. And the third is why you should avoid questions at the end. Let's start out with the first one, which is why you need to design part 3 of your presentation first. Imagine being woken up from a sound sleep and being able to give a presentation, a perfect presentation. To most people, such a scenario is unimaginable, and it was no different for me. Giving a presentation, even a short one, was very difficult when I was wide awake, let alone when I was tired and asleep and just woken up. And like most of us, presentations was reasonably terrifying. And then I ran into my friend Eugene Moreau, and he taught me how to break a presentation into 3 parts. And he was very fascinated with these 3 parts. In his teaching, he would talk about Huey and Dewey and Louie and Goldilocks and the 3 bears and 3 blind mice and the start, the middle, and the end. So 3 became this very crucial baseline on which we would have these presentations going. And he had me convinced, which is why 3 topics show up in all the presentations and even in this podcast. So everything is fine. We have 3 parts to the presentation. Everything's going really well. But I often found that was not enough. I would be running out of time, and it took a bit to figure out why this was the case. When Eugene said, break it up into 3, I did what you do with pizza, or with cake for that matter. I broke it up into 3 equal slices, and that was clearly a mistake. Instead of 3 equal slices, you need to split it up so that the most information is in part 1. There's a little less in part 2, and yes, you guessed right. Part 3 exists just as a little wedge, just this tiny little bit. The reason for such a breakup of information is because you're more likely to introduce the big concept at the start. Then you add a little bit more in the middle, and by the time you're reaching the third part, your audience is mentally scrambling. And they're scrambling to work out how to understand this information, how to apply it to their own business, what could go wrong. And this is why part 3 needs to be as tiny as possible. Let's take an example from the brain audit presentation. When I first started in the business, I'd go around and I'd give 30 to 45-minute presentations of the brain audit. The first part would introduce the main concepts of the brain audit. I'd talk about the 7 red bags, and then I'd list them out: problem, solution, target, profile. I'd go right through the whole list. And even though there were 7 red bags, I'd only cover 3 of them in the first part. So that is the problem, the solution, and the target profile. Which would take me to the second part of the presentation. And the second part didn't involve any new information. Instead, it took those 3 bags and it showed the audience how to use them. Take the problem, take the solution, take the target profile, put them together, and now they could create a trigger statement. The audience could create that trigger statement. So we've finished the first part, we've gone through the second part, created a trigger statement, and then it comes to the third part. The third part would explain why there needed to be a sequence, why you need to go and start off with the problem first and not the solution first. So why is this sequence in the brain audit? And how breaking that sequence would cause their client, the client who's buying from them, to hesitate, to walk away without making that purchase. And you can slightly see how this helps with keeping time, can't you? If each part is equally substantial and you lose track of time, or you get too deep in the examples, you get stuck. You're more likely to be in deep trouble if you've got a ton of slides to go. But let's say you've somehow managed to take up a lot of time in part 1, you can move quickly through part 2, and then part 3 becomes a bit of a formality. It closes the presentation because you don't want to leave those clients hanging. You want to get that closure in place. But keeping the third part super light is what will help you slide through to the end with loads of time to spare. However, things can and will go wrong under the best of conditions, which is why it's a good idea to make sure that everything goes fine in stage 2, long before the finale of your presentation. And the best way to make stage 2 super robust is to load it with examples. Examples? Why do you use examples? Let's find out. If we were to look at 3 parts of your presentation, they would roughly look like this. Part 1 would be the introduction of the concepts, part 2 would comprise of the examples, and part 3 would bring closure. Having examples in part 2 seems logical because you've introduced the concept in part 1, and the examples, they tend to help the audience understand that idea a lot better. However, loading the examples in part 2 is crucial from the point of keeping to time as well. It's not that you can't have examples in the first part of the presentation. However, it's more than likely that you've spent that first part introducing the concept. For instance, you may be introducing a concept like how to negotiate when the client is acting arrogant. If you've got that kind of topic, then you have to establish what arrogance means and how those arrogant situations can be minimized or reduced. So you're going to need that first part to just establish that and make sure that the audience knows exactly what you're talking about. Now you're moving to the second part and you're giving examples. The examples, as you can tell, allow the audience to understand that concept a lot better. And we know this. We've already covered this. So first part, concept, second part, examples. Let's say you have 3 examples and each one of them takes about 5 minutes to explain. This means that you're going to need at least 15 minutes to cover all 3. But those 15 minutes, they were under ideal conditions, under conditions where nothing was going wrong. And you've stepped on stage and the MC has taken up 5 more minutes and now you have just 10 minutes. And this is where you should have just 1 or 2 slides per example. Because if you have 7 or 8 slides per example, you're going to have to click through every one of them and it will look like you're rushing through them.